Thank you for being here. I have the privilege of actually getting to start the famous meet that Hans-Georg promised. And this session is about the first strategic goal that we have identified during this 1-year listening exercise and distilling all these ideas and suggestions and views that have come our way. So in this session, as the next 4, I will introduce you the core recommendations supporting each of the strategic goals and the main actions that we have identified and on which we are seeking input from our stakeholders, in fact, starting from today. Let me first focus on the word catalyze. According to the Oxford Dictionary, it is a person or a thing that precipitates an event. I actually prefer the Collins Dictionary definition. A catalyst is a person or thing that causes a change. A person or thing acting as the stimulus in bringing about or hastening a result. This is the ambition, in fact, to bring about a change, and the result being better serve the patients and the products that address their needs. Next slide, please. So let me start by focusing on your attention on the middle recommendation. So these are the 3 key recommendations, the 3 key buckets in which we can divide our recommendation in this strategic goal. So the middle one is important because it recognizes the regulator's key role in bringing products to patients, and we should never lose sight of this goal. I will go back to this point, but first let's look at the 2 sides of this triangle, the science and the technology. Regulators cannot simply sit and wait for products to be submitted to us. I think we have heard Carl today really speaking about initiatives, specific, very concrete initiatives that regulators are taking in Europe to liaise with the motor, with the engines of innovation in this continent, academia and other startups and new tech companies. We do need to listen to that. And in order to do that, we also need to anticipate, understand what is coming, and prepare ourselves accordingly. The challenges are many, but our vision, our will to bring about change, to be catalysts, coupled with the many tools that the legislation offers to us and the resources of the network in its entirety, equip us to face the future with confidence. So the next slide, please. Here are the 3 core recommendations focusing on science. I'll let you read them, but let me kind of guide through the essence of this recommendation. Each of them, in fact, stem from the recognition on how the advancement of science has already encountered the regulatory system and resulted in leaps and bounds and proactive initiatives that we needed to take and we need to take in order to address these challenges. Let's not forget that patient access remains central to us. The next few slides will show the actions that we identified for each of the core recommendations. So next slide, please. So the first one, support developments in precision medicines, biomarkers, and omics. Already several of our speakers have mentioned these points, and that needs engagement. It needs early engagement because we need to understand what is coming, how do we channel through the system. The thread that links these proposed actions is quite simple and yet hugely challenging. Biomarkers, omics, precision medicines are already impacting the system. The very definition of product is changing. And one may question whether the current system is fit for purpose. With its multiple entry points, already several colleagues and speakers have identified, several procedures addressing vertically each one of your encounters, of developers' encounters with the system. The very least we can do is to recognize these challenges and prioritize our actions accordingly. I want to attract your attention on the third action that we have identified, and we think we have already made advances in addressing that, in moving on in this particular space. The collaboration with HTA, payers and patients is very high in our list in this particular space, and we hear more about that later today in other sessions. And here I want also to attract your attention on the fact that none of these actions, no matter how related to a particular strategic goal can actually be taken in isolation. They are very interconnected and very related. When we speak now of evaluate the impact of biomarkers on clinical outcome together with HTA payers and patients, we are also naturally thinking of the collaboration with patients and payers and HTA in other sessions. So all these actions are in fact very strongly interconnected. So the next slide, please. The second recommendation that we have identified, it really focuses on ATMPs, gene and tissue-based products, because we have seen them. They come to the system, not very many, but they do come to the system, but they have not resulted yet, or not enough, into actual patient treatment, not in the numbers that we should expect. So there are many actions, again, in this bucket, and many of these actions we are already taking them on board in our daily life as EMA, of course, with the CAT, the Committee for Advanced Therapies, and with our interactions with developers at many levels. And I let you read those actions that we propose and will be part of our stakeholder engagement. But really here for ATMP, we really need to recognize that few of the products have made it to the bedside yet. And each of these actions proposed here is intended to keep pushing for this phenomenal scientific progress to actually be reaching patients in need. Again, you will see multiple links to other strategic goals, and many actions will be carried out by many actors with different roles and different emphasis. Particularly here, I want to remind you that there is an action plan that the agency has created together with the European Commission, and that focuses particularly on removing the hurdles to access to patient for ATMP. We are also keen on better evidence generation that is pertinent to downstream decision maker. Again, that's a thread that will go throughout the workshop and link many of our strategic goals. We see that as a hurdle to access. If we authorize medicine and then never meets the needs of downstream decision makers with evidence, then those medicines will never get to patients. Please, next slide. And in this bucket, you will not be surprised to find PRIME, our priority medicine scheme. We have identified PRIME as something that we want to invest on even more. And the recommendation is not surprising in the context of science and meeting the needs of patients. The medicine that promise to address unmet needs enter PRIME. Many of them have been and are and will be ATMPs. Many are being developed by small and medium enterprises. All will benefit and would benefit from increased collaboration with stakeholders. Let me highlight here one action particularly. Shorten the time between scientific advice, clinical trial, and marketing authorization application. We could discuss this at length. What does that mean and whether or not it makes any sense? However, we really need to recognize that the regulator's support to optimize the development is important, not just to shorten the evaluation time. This is not the goal. The goal is to optimize development. Equally important is the recognition that we have found within the system the will and the resources to provide what Hans-Georg defines as special love to those products that are more likely to give benefits to patients. Let's move on to the core recommendation related to technology. And again, here, I let you read them, but I want to highlight the common theme that stems from the recognition on how technology advancement impact already now and more to come in the future to the regulatory system. And the next few slides, move on please, will show the actions that we have identified and we're bringing to stakeholders for consultation. So the first core recommendation is underpinned by a number of actions that are shown in these slides. And I'm not going to read them out loud. You can do that on your own, but the message is very clear. As a network, we are fully aware of the fact that novel manufacturing technologies require new, innovative regulatory thinking. The very concept of point-of-care manufacturing at first sight collides with many of the established principles on how to ensure quality of a medicinal product. Just again to remind you that our standard quality, safety, efficacy assessment is in itself being questioned by this new concept and new approaches, and not only manufacturing. The next slide, please. Another core recommendation on technology that has a number of actions related to that. And this recommendation touches a topic that already now requires action and focus. The complexity of the EU system with the new devices and in vitro diagnostic regulation on the horizon is seen as a disincentive for startup and generally tech company that approach R&D in health with many of these borders being blurred. For them, it is important to deliver an outcome with a product rather than define what the product is. We start from the opposite approach. The mindset may clash with our regulatory system, but we can deal with that. At least we are supposed and we must deal with that if we want these advances of technology and science actually bring benefit to patients. So therefore, in this space also, action is needed. Next slide, please. So developing an understanding of and regulatory response to nanotechnology and new material utilization in pharmaceuticals. Again, all these actions are based on the awareness that there are gaps in our way to deal with nanomaterial and their utilization in pharmaceuticals. I will not dwell on that, but move on the next core recommendation that focuses on us, the regulator. And this reads, please, yes, it's fine, to diversify and integrate the provision of regulatory advice along the development continuum. This is the key role that EMA and the European Medicine Network has in bringing medicine to patients. We have seen that technology advancement demand upping the game. The action proposed here, in our view, exemplify how regulator can be creative, exploit the opportunity and the spaces provided by the legislative framework, assuming that we recognize and address the gaps as well as the needs. Getting advanced therapies to patients demands that we tackle misalignments in the regulatory space. Developers who have received scientific advice, approval for their pediatric plan, should rely on a smooth clinical trial setup process at a national level. Quality concerns should be predictable, predicted, and addressed. EMA and the EU Regulator Network have developed mechanisms to improve support to innovation. We will hear about it in bits and pieces by our panelists and, of course, in the other session. Important here is to highlight our willingness and commitment through specific action to make the support real and useful. And then let's move on to the last session and final one. To the last slides, yes. So back to the key message of this session, the first strategic call of our regulatory science strategy. If we really want to catalyze the integration of science and technology in medicine development, we should keep in mind the ultimate goal: bring medicines to patients. The 5 strategic calls all point in one direction, and we will explore today with our stakeholders how does that road look like from now until 2025. So with that, if you can put the panelists, yes, here we go. So with that, now we pass on to our panelists for the first session. And the way this all day is organized, as already has been mentioned, is that each of the panelists doesn't have slides. They have about 5 minutes. I think we are fine with our timing. So if each of you can briefly respond or have their views and their considerations on this particular strategic goal, and then we can, I'm sure we have time for discussion after after all the panelists present their views. So can I start with, please, Isa Ainonen is the co-chair of the EU Innovation Network from the Finnish agency. Isa, please.
Yeah, thanks, Enrica. And I'm glad to see that many of the issues on your slides actually in the very agenda of our EU Innovation Network meetings already. Perhaps it's good to briefly review what the EU Innovation Network is. It's a collaborative action between various national agencies and the EMA. Marisa Papaluka from EMA is the other chair. And our aim is to, first of all, to share information between each other. And as you know, we get inquiries from companies, from academic group, SMEs, and so on, to give national scientific advice. And it's important to list them and also flag some of the interesting ones, especially those where we don't even have regulations. So that has a very direct link to regulatory science. And also that we should also flag issues that may need to be discussed with the European Network Training Center, so that our assessors in national agencies are ready for the new technologies when they emerge. And that's again related to horizon scanning, which we are actually doing. And there is a new proposal that we should have it more structured, again together with the EMA, so that perhaps each agency could select a special area to follow and then contribute to the common goods, and again contributing to the regulatory science at the EU level. And naturally, one of the most important things is also to share common practices, to try to find the best practice, giving scientific advice, how to organize that, and so on. We also have a proposal we are suggesting a pilot for simultaneous national scientific advice. So if there are companies that want to see more than one national agency, that perhaps this could be done in a more efficient way, so that one could have a face-to-face meeting in one of the agencies and then the TC with the other ones, and also involving the HTA bodies there. Many of the agencies certainly also have the expertise on medical devices, so there's also important connection to that area also. Carl Broik mentioned the STARS project, which is kind of like a spin-off from the EU Innovation Network, where the main aim is really to increase the interaction between the national offices, innovation offices, and academic groups, and also to enhance the training for the academic groups on clinical guidelines and so on. I think that the the new regulation on clinical trials will integrate also the interpretation of various national agencies on the guidelines, and so we have the clinical trial facilitation group, which also has a similar role of discussing the very practical issue of clinical trials and so on. So they need to be very good collaboration between the EU Innovation Network and the clinical trial facilitation group also in the future. One important thing that is mentioned in the slides is indeed the challenge of companion diagnostics and how to assess them in the future. They can be combination products also, but especially companion diagnostics, if they don't have a CE mark, that will be a challenge, because then you should collaborate, for instance, with the notified bodies or then the unit or the medical devices within the agencies. But all in all, I believe that the EU Innovation Network is very much in the core of being a forum for learning between the agencies and also contributing strongly for the regulatory science at the EU level. Thank you. I think that was 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Esa. Then we move on to our next panelist, Sue Forder, representing FPA. Please, Sue.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and I'm delighted to participate today and offer comment on behalf of FPA. Before highlighting a number of the very encouraging proposals that Dr. Altieri presented, I wanted to reflect a little on the journey of regulatory science. And I think it's quite interesting that in the first EMA roadmap in 2005, regulatory science wasn't even mentioned. And certainly since then, as development stakeholders, I think that we've collectively achieved many milestones and overcome various roadblocks along the way. Since 2005, regulatory science has become more and more often mentioned in the various roadmaps. And the other key word which has been introduced and is now practically in every second sentence, of course, is HTA as well. So I think that while there are trends in regulatory science and the intersection of regulatory and HTA, which can be very clearly marked by the various strategic plans along the way, there are a number of elements of medicine's development that continue unchanged. And so the question really becomes, what regulatory processes could progress to make a meaningful difference, and how can regulatory science better harness new technologies for unmet need? And in her presentation, Dr. Altieri described some very good proposals to address these complex challenges. And there are 4 areas and one additional remark that I would like to comment on. We certainly see promise in EMA's proposals aimed at better tailoring regulatory engagement moments to each specific product. And in addition, the proposals to integrate the evaluation framework for medicines and medical devices and to leverage multi-stakeholder consultation platforms holds much potential. We certainly support prioritising the promotion of the PRIME scheme, and we're very pleased to see the proposal for the increased investment. As I'm sure you will not be particularly surprised, we would also ask that the EMA consider making PRIME available for new indications and for all products at any stage in development, regardless of the size of the company. We also believe that if the EMA were able to implement the concept of rolling evaluations, this could lead to more efficient reviews and enhanced exchange of information throughout the review procedures, and could ensure that the EU review processes remain globally competitive. Fourthly, the evolution of the omics technologies and identification of new biomarker targets has increasingly led to disease being defined on a molecular basis, opening up the area of personalized medicines, and the increasing availability of data from registries and electronic health records has the potential to support discussions on more outcomes-based healthcare systems. And so to that end, it will be very important that our regulatory system accommodates the breadth of these scientific developments with dynamic approaches to regulatory assessment. Now, thinking of all the efficiencies and accommodation for regulatory science advantages, I have to mention the clinical trial regulation, which has been picked out several times already this morning, and in particular, the implementation of the EU portal and the database, because I think that the clinical trial regulation was warmly welcomed by the industry. And in addition, as mentioned by the MEP, it is there to help foster innovation, which is so terribly important for FPIA. And we are concerned at the moment that the implementation of this portal could have a lasting and detrimental effect on the ability to conduct innovative clinical trials in Europe. And we're thinking here particularly of innovative clinical trial designs, which are being increasingly incorporated into our development plans. And these could be impacted by the CT regulation and the way the portal is being implemented, because we feel that at the moment the portal is being developed along the premise of a very traditional randomized control study. And so what we would ask is that these issues be further considered to ensure that the portal be implemented in a manner that does not hinder running these innovative trials in Europe. And just to illustrate the long-term potential implications of getting this wrong, I would like to mention the First-in-Man guideline, which was finalized in July 2017 and became effective earlier this year. And while there had anyway been a decline in phase 1 trials in Europe for several years, the overall influence of the revised First-in-Man guideline has had the unintended consequence of cutting this region out of phase 1 research almost completely. So, and the reason for this for many companies is that the companies believe that the guideline does not allow them to assess the full dose range in the phase 1 study that then will allow them to go into phase 2 appropriately, and they might get the dose wrong. So I think that this illustrates how terribly important it is to try and get implementation right. And we want the EU to be at the forefront of advancing regulatory science. And therefore, we must continue to be an active participant in medicines research. In conclusion, I believe that the EMA strategy to 2025 is a great opportunity to drive us further down the path to bring innovative medicines to patients. And I would certainly like to thank the EMA very much indeed for having organized this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And I think your intervention only highlights how interconnected all the topics will be. You chose to focus on the clinical trial regulation and the clinical trial design, which in fact will be also addressed in other sessions. But it just shows the points that we only artificially separate up to a point all the themes, but our commitment is actually to see the whole view, the whole vision in a strategic and more holistic way. So I think all these contributions are very welcome. So we pass on to Dario Pirovano, representing Medtech Europe. He's just sitting there. So thank you, Dario, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Enrica. Well, first of all, let me say that it is always surprising for people which is dealing with medical devices to sit at EMA. In particular, I'm dealing with medical devices for the last 40 years, 35 of which dealt with regulatory affairs. I've heard today mentioning the new MDR, Medical Device Regulation, and IVDR. And I've heard a certain number of consideration on these two texts. We hope we will be able to make comments on whether or not they are working as intended, provided that will be possible to have them applied according to the timescale which has been indicated into the text. And for that, we start in having some concerns in relation to the timing which is taking to put in place a certain number of implementing measures, but not only. The most important is the availability of notified bodies, which is far from being clear. The regulations, as it has been said by the Commission representative before, yes, have been affected by the PIP scandals and so on. And you see immediately that they have been drafted under the emotion of these scandals. And so they contain a lot of principles which are obviously useful to allow the placing on the market and therefore the rendering available to patient medical devices. But in many instances, they lack specific indication on how to apply these principles. And I think that this is really the place where there is the need, a strong need, to put together all the stakeholders which might be interested. And in the specific case of the drug-device combination or the combination products, we need to find a way to put together really the people which have a stake in these products. But before that, we need to be absolutely sure that there is some sort of a, some sort of a cultural change. We need, on both sides, not to try to adapt a system which we are used to use, and I'm saying this for the medical devices, but also for the pharma people, to stretch it to meet the challenges of a new technology or a new therapy or a novelty in general. And we need to try to find a way whereby we are able to bring to the discussion our knowledge, our experience, in such a way to have something which is perfectly adapted to the regulatory challenge that the new system, the new therapy, the new technology may bring. I've heard mentioning the ATMP. Some of you know that I've been part of the discussion on the ATMP many years ago. And I have to say that the ATMP, while it has done its job, although I've heard that it's not been really extensive with the gene and cell therapy products, it had a mitigated success, let's say, with tissue engineer products. And my personal opinion is that this is also due to the fact that in that case, unfortunately, there has been the tentative to adapt a system, a technology, a concept to something which was not fitting 100%. When I say that people should be sitting around a table and bringing their own experience and interests and help in producing a guidance, and God only knows how many guidance will be necessary to have the MDR and the IVDR really working, we need to really think what is the purpose. It is already a given that the input of patients, the opinion of patients, is fundamental. It is also a given, at least in the medical device area, that the input of healthcare professionals is fundamental because with medical devices, and I repeat this since 30 years, I guess, the efficacy of a medical device is 50% the device itself and 50% the doctor which is using it on the patient. Therefore, it is absolutely important that when you are working at a guidance, at something which is going to render easier and quicker, because this is something that the patients are asking for, a device or a product in any case, let's call it a health products. Let's try to stay out of the schemes, the medical devices, the pharmaceuticals, and so on. We are speaking about health products now. Many of these are combination of various technologies, various inputs, which cannot really fit within any of the definitions. And therefore, probably, they will need something which is specifically adapted to them and at the same time sufficiently flexible to be able to do its job. I think that for the time being, this is everything I have to say. I would have loved to speak more about the MDR, but apart from the fact that it happens in the worst possible case time of the world, because on top of everything else, I know that we do not have to speak about Brexit, but just to let you know, apparently 50% of the certificates which allow a CE marking of a medical device today are today given by UK notified bodies. So when I spoke about the potential shortage of notified bodies before, well, you can imagine what this means. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dario. And we move on to Maria Pascual, who is representing here the EBE in this panel. Maria, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the opportunity to share the perspectives of EBE. EBE is the European Trade Association representing biopharmaceutical companies. EBE is pretty active in the advanced therapy space, and I have the pleasure to chair its working group. And these days, I do think that advanced therapies are indeed a very good case and example to have the discussion on the challenges and ways of integrating novel therapies and novel science and technology. And it was great to see that was coming clearly as one of the core recommendations. I would like to start by acknowledging the efforts and advances led by the CAT jointly with the Commission in the ATMP action plan. But would like also to stress that further work is needed, especially, we said it before, this field moves so rapidly. The CAT and CHMP have gained experience recently in applying flexibility and adaptation of regulatory science to the very unique characteristics of some of these modern modalities. And we had the experience of the CAR-T products recently being approved. But the regulatory system of the future needs more of this to efficiently translate these hopes for the patients rapidly. And I wanted to highlight today 5 priorities, and a lot has been said, which is good to see alignment within the different parties. So first point goes, again, no surprise, to the importance of facilitating clinical trials, which is an issue in general, but very important, particularly in the field of ATMPs. And we see day on day the statistics on the ongoing CAR-T studies. Again, Europe clearly lagging behind US, China, and Japan here. So which are the challenges and opportunities in this area? On the one hand side, we still experience very long review timelines and still experience different levels of requirements and expectations for clinical trials in the ATMP space coming from different member states. And some of our products still have the additional need to comply with the GMO, genetically modified organism requirements, with different documentation and needs and approval frameworks amongst different member states. To this matter, there's a positive message looking forward to see improvements in the clinical trial regulation. We'll see. We believe also that more guidance is needed on minimum requirements for early trials in the space, and really the flexibility and a stepwise approach as products move to confirmatory late trials, and we know CAT is actively working on that. We recognize also recent major advances done by the European Commission in the GMO front, but more is needed, and we have to keep attentive to that point. The other aspect could be the acceptance of modern trials, innovative clinical designs, and we discuss about this in both in the pre and post marketing setting. And this goes to adaptive and also master protocols, umbrellas, and basket trials in immuno-oncology, which is a very active field in this ATMP space. Second point would be promote and invest in PRIME scheme. We heard that before. Though this is not only important for SMEs, of course, the PRIME scheme is a very useful approach that supports innovation through our small and medium enterprises. Third would be the support of the developments in precision medicine, biomarkers, and omics. We heard in the introductory some remarks on that. We all see this revolution in the understanding on how this is going, and this is leading to stratification clearly on diseases in subsets, and we know much more on this. And type 1 diabetes, we know 7 distinct types now. And in this context, biomarkers, a next generation of sequencing and other omics require very rapid adaptation of the regulatory framework. Fourth point goes to global convergence. We have not talked much on this one, but really enhancing the engagement with other regions, especially in this ATMP space, is needed, and we have some big topics there. Testing requirements for cells and tissues, similarity concept for orphan drugs. All this ultimately will facilitate data acceptability in the different regions, and really being able to design and develop global trials. And last point, again, goes to evidence generation, and HTA payers, patients need to be better linked into the system, and more discussion also around registries is deserved. And by coincidence, last week at the EVE, we got a message from a patient on this topic, so I was happy to quote him today. He was saying, initially I thought that there is nothing worse than a disease without treatment, and then I learned that it is so much worse if there is an authorized medicine available, but patients cannot access to it because of ongoing HTA considerations. So with this, my final remark would be to thank the agency for organizing such a forum for dialogue, and really encourage Kat and the rest of the committees to keep promoting, as they are indeed doing, and facilitating dialogue with all the stakeholders in this complex field. We still need alignment in some areas, and we have a big agenda on still on comparability, immunogenicity, and others. Sometimes we hear that the ATMPs are the perfect storm, but I think indeed our responsibility is to manage this storm and facilitate the transition of translation of these hopes to our patients. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria and EBE. And again, I think it's interesting how we start seeing the upstream and downstream that Simone presented before. So in order to catalyze innovation, we also need to think of the needs of the downstream decision makers. Otherwise, all this innovation, it doesn't turn into medicines for patients. So let's move on with the same panel. So Maud Perrudin, representing the self-medication industry in Europe. And please, Maud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Enrica, and thank you very much to EMA indeed for this invitation and for the scope of this session. Here also I want to start by clarifying what will be the purpose of my talk. I will focus really on one of your core recommendations, which we really much welcome, which is to really create an integrated evaluation pathway for assessment of devices, IVDs, and borderline products. And here I'm talking on behalf of ISGP, but focusing on the substance-based medical devices we represent as part of the self-care products. And so obviously ISGP is also known to this forum more for the non-prescription medicine, but that will not be the focus of what I'm going to talk now. So for us, it's really very timely, this regulatory conference, because obviously, just like Dario mentioned, regarding the medical devices implementation, it's a huge development for us, because it's an official recognition of the concept of substance-based medical device, which is not the traditional concept of a device, and which potentially triggers new questions from a regulatory scientific standpoint. But obviously, also the MDR gives much more requirements and, like, let's say, a role for EMA and the medicines authorities as well in the area of devices. And so to this point, we really much as ISGP welcome one of the objectives that has been identified at the beginning in your presentation about supporting the enriching the expertise at the interface between medicines and medical devices, because very much there is a need for better and harmonized understanding of basically what makes the difference between a medicine and a device. And when it's a substance-based, it's potentially a more challenging question, and clarifying what is not actually acting by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. And this is not an easy way, but this is something where EMA has definitely a role, just like the medicines authorities, so that we can make sure that the legal frameworks can coexist at the same time. And while it was made clear, and I think we definitely support that the legislation follows science and not the other way around, I think the MDR recognition of substance-based devices is actually not coming before science, but really the other way around. And it's really just recognizing that, because of this development of science, we have a better knowledge of what is actually a mode of action of substance-based products. And that should be also reflected in the regulatory science to be developed. The other point that was also highlighted in the slide was to facilitate the regulatory pathway between notified bodies and medicines regulator. And in our view, this also really needs and requires better clarification, because obviously the rules in the legislation doesn't make everything, and most of it is to be done by implementation. And clarity is needed on respective and collaborative role between notified bodies and medicines authorities, because now that there is also increasing role in the assessment of those products in the medical devices, we want to avoid obviously a disproportionate regulatory burden in the device assessment. And this requires an inclusive approach with all the actors of the system. And also to the point at the very beginning made on the definition of regulatory science for the EMA, at least as it exists today, I think there is one point which the MDR is actually potentially questioning to push a bit further the definition, is that potentially EMA now has a clear role as well in defining what's the regulatory status of a product. And this goes beyond what is actually assessing the quality, safety, and efficacy of a medicinal products, because here it's basically assessing what is potentially not a medicinal product. And that's quite a new topic, and that's not something that I think the Medicines Authority have normally been doing, because it's not their primary purpose. But now they have a role in this, and we think as ASGP that there is an increasing need for regulatory science in that area as well, for getting better expertise in what is not a pharmacological mode of action. And so, last but not least, I want really to plea for an inclusive regulatory system there, so that, as we know, in any borderline cases, and to avoid that the whole system and the new products that are coming in the MDR framework collapse by just putting too many products in the borderline situation, where basically we're just asking ourselves what's the proper classification. We really think that an inclusive system that allows stakeholders to be properly involved at an early stage, and that really allows a case-by-case assessment of products, and that allows this kind of discussion, will facilitate an implementation for all the actors of the system and regulators as well, to avoid spending too much time as well at this border when it's preventing patient access to useful healthcare solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maud. And let's move on to our last panelist, Emma Dufour from Europa Bio. And Emma, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And being last in the panel session to speak, obviously a lot of the comments have been made. From a Europa Bio perspective, we looked to see what was our most important points we wanted to bring forward. And I'm very pleased to see what great alignment I'm hearing from all of the presenters so far around where some of these priorities are coming from. And the first of the three that Europa Bio would like to highlight is that for these novel technologies and approaches to medicines develop, that early and iterative exchange with stakeholders is essential to share, discuss, and consider the best path forward for bringing these new treatments to patients. So it's that real, true early science conversation that really then embeds the understanding for everyone involved and has a smooth path forward. And opportunities for advice and dialogue therefore need to be available along that continuum, and it was great to see, Enrico, in your presentation, a recognition of perhaps an evolution of that system. I think it's also important that those opportunities really do offer that early scientific exchange and go right through to the post-approval setting. It's a continuum and it's iterative. It doesn't stop. It's a continual learning and then continual relook at where we are and our understanding of these innovations. To allow that to happen, the advice mechanism does need to be very agile and to embrace and learn from emerging science early, as well as supporting lighter touch dialogue opportunities and feedback at stages of development that are key for decision making. Rather than perhaps a single fixed framework, we do need to try and find ways for that advice and dialogue to be flexible and ongoing. And this can streamline the downstream activities, particularly if the scientific advice is able to bring the relevant scientific experts to the table and many other stakeholders at critical time points. And I'd like to stress that I'm not just talking about the HTA bodies and the payers. I'm talking about healthcare professionals, I'm talking about scientific expertise, and really making sure the system is able to flex and bring the right people to the table for the conversation at the right point in the development. I was also very encouraged to hear about the EU Innovation Network and the bringing together of all of the expertise within the network. I think sometimes we separate out national scientific advice and EMA scientific advice, and in fact, this is a pool of fantastic expertise. I think it's very exciting to think about the possibilities that might bring to bring that flexible and lighter touch approach as well. And I was also very encouraged to hear the mention of the Clinical Trials Facilitation Group. Again, we sometimes see a somewhat artificial divide between looking at the clinical trials that are ongoing and advice with regard to evidence generation from different parties in the system. So where we can think about that coming together will be very, very beneficial. The second area for Europa Bio members that is important is around a very common theme you've heard over and over again, that innovative medicines today are increasingly developed in combination with a device, a diagnostic and or a digital tool of some nature. And this trend is expected to continue and accelerate. And whilst these approaches may increase the complexity of our assessment, they do offer fantastic potential for these more targeted, patient-focused therapies. It's therefore important for the system in Europe to be able to adapt to this complexity and really ensure the regulatory system is able to accommodate these advances without extending regulatory timelines, but bringing all of the right people together. So as colleagues have already said, it is breaking down those barriers, not looking at these as artificially separate pieces, but looking holistically at their medical intervention and coming to a good decision around that. And the final piece to highlight is that as well as the need for the agency to be ready to assess these new scientific approaches to medicines developed, we'd also like the agency to consider the role it plays in supporting the acceptance of these new approaches in the wider healthcare system. And again, not just thinking about the HTA bodies, which has been the traditional new additional stakeholder, although they're very, very important, is remembering those healthcare professionals and the wider healthcare system that can truly benefit from the understanding that's been developed along the assessment and really help that adoption at the patient care level. At the same time, we're very mindful of the number of priorities and areas of focus that the agency could choose to take over the next few years. And so we would like to encourage the agency to focus on that regulatory science, that bedrock, and helping these new products to be assessed and understood in the system, and other stakeholders will drive, much of the science research itself. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Emma. We are doing really well with time, so I think we'll give ourselves about 15 minutes for Q&A. Questions can be directed to this panel, but also to the previous one. So we may have opportunities for doing that in the course of the day. Ansgar.
Could someone please educate me about something I don't understand? I've just heard that Europe is over-regulated, and therefore we're driving innovation out of Europe. And the first-in-man guideline was quoted. And I can relate to that. I can totally understand how you can kill innovation by regulation. But at the same time, I'm hearing, we want guidance on this or that. Now, I love reading the fables by Jean de La Fontaine. And there is one fable titled The Frogs Who Desired a King. And the frogs ask Zeus, the king of gods, to give them a king because they have so much freedom. Read it. It does not have a happy ending for the frogs. So can we please clarify, and I think this goes to the very heart of this debate on regulatory science, how much guidance is useful, where do you need it, and when do you need it for? Bearing in mind that every guidance necessarily will restrict the freedom of the innovator, otherwise it wouldn't be guidance. So could we elaborate on that, please?
Dario.
I'm very grateful of this question. There are guidances and guidances. For example, and I will give you the easiest one for which we are struggling, it is said in the medical device regulation that you are not obliged to run a brand new clinical investigation with a high-risk device which is already on the market since quite some time if you're able to produce, quote, sufficient clinical data. Full stop. Now, you need to have some guidance, or call it the way you want, something where you put together and you agree on what you, the manufacturer, and them, the notified body, will agree of what could be considered to be sufficient. If it is like that, taking into account the number of notified bodies, taking into account the number of medical device manufacturers, you will never have some certainty, regulatory certainty. Now, having said that, I entirely agree with you that there is a situation which has been, well, mentioned yesterday in another conference, and it is apparently a trend that we're going to see that, as I said before, the MDR has been something which has followed the emotion, and it is a politically driven text, which inevitably is very complicated. The old result of this is that where the innovation in medical device has been in the last 28 years, developed mostly in Europe and then exported to the States, in conjunction of a change of direction of the FDA, which goes exactly the other way around, we might expect that innovation will see his first days in the States and then exported to Europe. It is a possibility, nothing is carved on stone, but this is what we are fearing.
Thank you, Dario. I encourage questions from the rest of the audience, otherwise it becomes a conversation between panelists. Any questions? Burning or otherwise? Thomas.
So good morning, everybody. First of all, thanks for some very good presentations and remarks. It's easy to agree with much what's been said. Maybe I should also say that it says CHMP here, but I'm ex-CHMP, so what I'm going to say is more a personal reflection. But it's easy to agree with some of the comments. For example, Sue, you made comments related to PRIME, the clinical trial regulation. I think you even mentioned the word rolling review, if I recall correctly. And that's all in the interest of facilitating drug development. And there's also been comments relating to the long-term perspective, and I like the River Po view that everything is a continuum here. So, but it also comes down to priorities, and I think it was good, Alan, that you brought out that CRS slide, because in the end, it's a matter of the total time, and it's the priorities. And if we do agree that it's worth investing in regulatory expertise in facilitating drug development time and also facilitating access to patients downstream, maybe we all have to agree that we shouldn't focus on exactly the statistics that you brought out. Because in the end, it's a matter of where we put the priorities.
Yeah, I mean, I did try to qualify the statistics. I knew that would be the rejoinder. Hans-Georg and I also discussed this back in June. The statistics aren't everything. I think they show a direction of travel. They're KPIs for the European system in a global context, and therefore I think we need to take cognizance of the direction of travel. The point I tried to make is people in sponsor companies developing drugs globally are looking at these kind of data and saying, well, is Europe globally competitive? Do we focus on Europe as an initial launch country? So that was where my focus was really on the metrics.
No, I understand that, but I think it's important also industry partners defend the strategy that we're developing here in the end, and saying that maybe this is well invested time for the overall objectives that we have. So we're all buying into this because it's to me that is very important.
And I agree. I think that was reflected in the last slide that I presented around the strong degree of collaboration. I think, though, I would also add the point I was trying to make about short-term deliverables. We need to show something here. It can't be just a deliverable in 5 years, or we lose the respect of our various organisations. So I think a strong partnership with some short-term deliverables is.
If I can, please. Isa, just a second, because I have a question on the other side, and if we could avoid loops of conversation. Thank you.
So, John Rex, I am a physician representing both the small company and Wellcome Trust, a large public funder. And I wanted to pick up actually on Hans-Georg's comment about, do we have too much, do we have too little guidance? Because I think there's a really deep theme there. Guidance cuts both ways. It provides guidance to industry about what's expected. It also provides guidance to the regulators about what is expected, what is possible, and what is practical. And I think I've seen good examples of that. I work primarily in the antimicrobial resistance space, where we've had a lot of conversations about how much data you can generate in this area. And stating that something is not possible or that only limited work can be done, it's actually useful for everybody to get that out on the table and have that debate. So I think that's the pickup. I like your fable about the frogs. The frogs asked for too much. You're correct. But the notion of guidance having two directions that it flows, I think is a very powerful tool for all of us.
Thank you. I have a gentleman here on my left.
Okay. I'm Rogerio Gaspar. I'm representing here the European Federation for Pharmaceutical Sciences. I'm currently the Vice President. And yesterday and the day before, myself and Hans-Georg, we were in Brussels for the 10th anniversary of Innovative Medicines Initiative. And I couldn't feel more non-alignment between the discussions that we have seen in Brussels and the discussions that we are seeing here. And probably this is relevant because the panel is called Catalyzing the Integration of Science and Technology in Drug Development. And I always see this clash of cultures between the corporate regulatory affairs tradition and the regulatory science and technology development. Coming from a scientific society and a learning society, and having been in this agency from the first day in 1995, I can see where the divide is, really, a lack of communication. I think that the European Medicines Agency has done a wonderful work in the last 23 years in incorporating patient organizations and other societal stakeholders, but probably not enough in terms of integrating learning societies and scientific societies. We feel we represent about 15,000 pharmaceutical scientists all over Europe in major research institutes and national organizations. And the position that we see from our side, we are tolerated in the system, but we are not caught into the system as probably other corporate stakeholders are. And when we are talking about the strategy for regulatory science, this is very important because the procedures that you are developing here need to integrate the new knowledge that is coming from the scientific base. And this is about the disconnect between the discussion I see here today and the discussions we have seen the previous 2 days in Brussels for IMEI. And what industry and academia are doing in Innovative Medicines Initiative, it's very relevant for the future of the operation of the system. And I think that probably this needs to be more reflected and more aligned with the strategy that is going for a public consultation right now. I always feel that these procedures need to be at some level of integration. We are discussing in Brussels Horizon Europe and the future of medicines research and development within the framework program. But at the same time, this is not aligned with any regulatory science strategy on the table at the European Parliament right now. And three quick topics also to foster the discussion and the thoughts for your regulatory science strategy up to 2025. Three examples of things that need to be tackled up front. When you talk about novel manufacturing, we tend to forget that the manufacturing dogma for regulation is already more than 50 years old. And a very good example is that our GMP regulation right now has a basic dogma about the full separation between quality control and production. And this is completely incompatible with the new process analytical technologies that we are developing and implementing at the manufacturing lines. The same when the regulators talk about nanotechnology. This is my research area, so I'm pretty at ease on that one. You tend to talk about nanotechnology like a kind of science fiction thing. So when you are talking about materials, the major problem with the new materials is with the new inorganic, non-biodegradable materials. Because the biodegradable materials, we have seen them coming up through the regulatory system since 1995 in the centralized procedure with liposomal formulations and so forth. So we have to be very precise in terms of the scope, not enlarging too much. And finally, a third point that is probably being missed also is the issues about education and training activities. Because one of the things we are feeling from the scientific community, and we had the discussion between our organization and EMA almost a year ago about this issue also, is because of the political pressures coming mostly, I have to say, from my side, from the European Parliament and other stakeholders, we are seeing European Medicines Agency less and less present in European projects. And this is really something very important because you cannot move forward in terms of bridging a kind of community with regulators, industry and academia if the regulators simply are not there, or if the coordination of the regulators through this house just says that, and there's a kind of devolution system that, well, you can go with the national agencies, but the European Medicines Agency is out of that one. We all know it's not enough. We feel the need of the European Medicines Agency on those projects and align with those constituencies. So a further note for your reflection paper.
Thank you very much. Very useful considerations and other views. Here. On the left, on the right here, and then the lady in the back.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Henrik Nielsen, representing FPIA. Just wanted to pick up on Hans Georg's question about the level of regulations, where I think what is important here is not to be over-regulated, but enable a good discussion between regulators and agency. And I think Sue put forward that maybe we could prioritize to have an earlier and dialogue in the case of evolving science, where it is important that we have early dialogue with the regulators. Sometimes even both having the dialogue with the EMA and the FDA so that we can move on with a global clinical trial development program. So not too regulated, but good contacts with regulators would be my pitch.
Thank you. Christine, actually, no? Is you? Oh, no, next to you. Yes.
Hello, thank you. I'm Sinead Skola from FPIA, representing the R&D-based industry. I would like to come back to the very positive point made by Esa Heinonen on behalf of Innovation Network. And you brought forward one good idea for Innovation Network to bring each agency selecting a specific area to contribute to the regulatory science in Europe. So could you elaborate a little bit for our information how that could look like in practice, and could that expertise for instance, be brought on board in different stages of regulatory decision making, not only from educational point of view as sharing information, which is of course a very important point as well.
Esa, please, and then we can start concluding this panel.
Yeah, thank you. So this is certainly one idea that will be proposed to the HMA meeting in November. And the idea is that everybody acknowledges that the field of medicine and technology is so huge that one agency or even EMA or FDA cannot master it separately. So it would be a good idea for each agency to select one area of interest. And naturally, this process is being discussed that how small the area can be, because we are doing that in any case, that we have to follow the field. And perhaps when we have the whole map then done, now we have 24 agencies in this innovation network, and there is also very good connection to the ICMRA at the global level. One is also thinking what would be the best practices for horizon scanning. So we are not talking only on the EU level, but hopefully in the future also on the global level together with the FDA. So that then it would enhance the possibility of authorities to invest on following up very early technologies, and therefore actually this discussion that was actually suggested just recently by FPA could actually take place in a very smooth way.